no one saw it coming. The courtroom was humming with quiet murmurs. Every gaze locked on the prosecution's table until the back doors swung open and in walked Will Smith. Not a word. Not a press team. No legal entourage trailing behind him. Just Will. Alone, gasps echoed through the chamber. Even the judge's stoic expression cracked into surprise. Up until this moment, Will had stayed completely silent. No interviews, no public statements, nothing on social media. Meanwhile, rumors swirled, secret court leaks trickled out, and recordings, so disturbing they were never released to the public, were whispered about like urban legends. But Will, he remained a ghost in the narrative. Until now. Something had shifted. Maybe the weight of the evidence finally crushed whatever resolve he had left. Maybe someone he trusted betrayed him, or maybe just maybe after watching those private tapes behind closed doors, something inside him snapped. Because this wasn't Will the celebrity. This wasn't a red carpet entrance. This was a man ready to speak, not for fame, not for drama, but because he had seen too much to stay silent. He walked straight to the witness stand without making eye contact with a soul, not even Diddy, at the defense table. Diddy had been casually whispering with his attorneys. That stopped cold. Judge raised an eyebrow. Diddy froze mid-sentence. His face drained of color as he watched Will pass by, deliberate and unshaken. "I wasn't subpoenaed," Will began, his voice even but heavy. "I chose to come." The judge allowed it. And just like that, the trial took a sharp turn away from speculation and headlines into uncharted territory. What Will Smith was about to reveal hadn't made it into any tabloid or gossip site. There were no tweets, no viral videos. This was a buried story, one that had haunted him for years. "I've directed movies about bravery," he continued. "I've played roles about doing the right thing, won awards for pretending to be heroes." Then he turned slightly in Diddy's direction. "But this isn't acting. It all began," he said, "with an invitation. Nothing out of the ordinary, least on the surface. It came through a mutual connection, someone well-known and highly respected in the industry. According to them, it was just another one of Diddy's legendary private parties. Elite guests, discreet location. A place to talk business and mingle. Will had received invitations like this before. He didn't even think twice. But when he arrived, something felt off. The mansion was perched on a secluded hill, its winding driveway lined with identical black SUVs. Security wasn't just at the gate, was everywhere, inside and out. The moment he stepped through the front doors, his phone was confiscated. "They said it was for our comfort and safety," Will said, his tone shifting. But it felt like they were making sure no one could record anything or call for help. As he was guided through the estate, a strange tension filled the air. Soft jazz played in the background. Dim lights flickered across luxurious furniture, and yet it all felt stage-like, the set of a film where the real action was happening just off camera. He noticed mirrors at strange angles, subtly reflecting parts of the room that shouldn't have needed reflecting. It was like everything was being watched, he explained. After a while, Diddy approached him personally. They chatted briefly, shared a drink, and then Diddy leaned in close. "Now you'll see why our circle is so powerful." He said Will didn't know what that meant until Diddy led him to a hidden staircase at the back of the house. They descended into a dimly lit lower level, one Will hadn't even noticed before. What he saw next, he said, froze my blood. There were people, recognizable faces, lounging in uncomfortable positions, visibly intoxicated or otherwise out of sorts. Some were passed out, others looked dazed, confused. And yet, cameras, discreet ones, were recording. They weren't all willing participants, Will said. Some of them looked like they wanted to leave, but couldn't. Diddy. He wasn't just a host, he was in control. He was giving directions like a film producer deciding who went where, what happened next, and who watched. Others in the room, also sober and focused, were observing. And recording, Will paused. The point wasn't to have fun. The point was to confuse, to disorient, to make sure you didn't really know what was happening until it was too late. And once you did, you were already part of it. That's when he said something that made the entire courtroom lean in, sitting back and saying nothing. After you witness something like that, that's not neutrality. That's complicity. 1 week later, a package showed up at Will's. Private residence and address he hadn't shared with anyone at the party. Inside was a flash drive and a note. "Welcome to the family." Will didn't open the file at first. But eventually, curiosity or dread got the best of him. What he saw confirmed his worst fear. It was footage from that night, he told the court. Parts of it showed me just there, not participating, just observing, but edited in a way that made it look like I was in on it. That was the moment he realized the truth. This wasn't a party. It was a trap, a blackmail factory. Each person invited wasn't just there to enjoy themselves. They were being recorded, monitored, cataloged for leverage. And the more famous you were, the more valuable your footage became. A few days later, Diddy called him personally, asked how he liked his welcome gift, then casually floated the idea of working together. It was subtle, Will said, but the meaning was crystal clear. We're in this now. You and me, and you don't get to walk away. Will's voice never wavered, even as he revisited the fear that had consumed him for years. He shared one particularly chilling anecdote: a young actor he'd met that night. Charismatic, talented, full of potential. But after refusing to cooperate with Diddy's circle, that actor's career mysteriously dried up. No callbacks, no offers, no public scandal, just silence. He vanished, Will said, and I knew why. He paused, looking around the courtroom. For a long time, I told myself I was protecting my family, my work, my name. But the truth is I was helping the system stay alive. After that night, the invitations didn't stop. In fact, they came more frequently, always polished, always exclusive, always promising discretion. And every time, Will declined. Something seemed to go wrong. A deal I was involved in would suddenly collapse, he explained. A director I'd signed with would mysteriously back out. Scripts promised to me would land in someone else's hands without explanation. At first, he chalked it up to coincidence. That's just the nature of show business, right? Projects fall apart. Opportunities vanish. But it kept happening. The exact moments he turned Diddy down. And he wasn't the only one. Will recounted quiet conversations with fellow performers. Conversations where no one said too much, but just enough to know they were all living the same reality. We started using coded language, he admitted. We'd ask if someone had visited the house or if they'd received a gift. No one ever explained what they meant, because we were all afraid someone was listening. Everyone knew that saying too much of N in private could be weaponized against them. In 2017, Will nearly spoke out. He was ready. He'd confided in someone he trusted. He even started preparing a statement. 3 days later, a blog published a salacious story about his personal life, completely fabricated, but so well crafted it felt real. Details twisted just enough to make it look plausible. It was calculated, he told the court, like a warning shot. The message was loud and clear. We can control the story, and we'll destroy you if you try to write your own. From that moment forward, Will backed down. Again, because what he was up against wasn't just a person, it was an empire. Diddy wasn't just a name in the music industry. According to Will, His influence extended far beyond beats and record deals. He had media connections, business partners, and leverage with advertisers. His network included some of the most powerful names in Hollywood and beyond. If you were aligned with him, Will said, your problems disappeared. Court cases vanished. Bad press never made it to print. But if you crossed him, you'd wake up to a storm of anonymous tips. It's a scandal no one could trace back. Or suddenly, you'd become a liability to every brand you worked with, and people tried to escape. Talented ones, brave ones. But when they pushed back, their lives, both personal and professional, were dismantled. Relationships dissolved. Friends disappeared. Career paths turned to dust. It was like being erased in real time, Will said, his voice tightening. He paused again, emotions carefully restrained. For years, I convinced myself I was doing the right thing by keeping quiet. That staying silent was protecting my family, my legacy. But eventually, the evidence started surfacing. People began speaking up. Lawsuits were filed, names were named. And I realized, he took a deep breath. Silence wasn't protection. It was complicity. He recalled reading the first major news story linking Diddy to criminal investigations. It was surreal. A decade earlier, he might have dismissed it as rumor. But now he knew better. I told myself, it's not my story to tell. I figured those who had suffered the most should speak first. But then he watched what happened to them. Witnesses who dared come forward were publicly dissected, their motives questioned, their mental health scrutinized. The media turned them into punchlines or liars. Character assassinations ran side by side with the actual reporting. The final straw came unexpectedly. Will was at home, surrounded by family, when a push notification lit up his phone. A witness one whose story had eerily echoed. His own had just recanted. All of a sudden, he said, it never happened. That's what they were reporting. That it had all been a misunderstanding. But Will knew the truth. That wasn't a change of heart. That was pressure. That was fear. That was the machine doing what it's designed to do. That night, he didn't sleep. Instead, he paced, haunted by the faces he'd seen, the voices he'd heard, and the things he'd chosen to forget. How many lives had been wrecked while I stayed quiet? He wondered aloud. How many careers lost? How many people hurt? And then came the question that changed everything. If even someone like me, famous, wealthy, protected, felt powerless, what chance did anyone else have? The next morning, he picked up the phone. No more secrets. No more delays. He called the prosecutors. I told them everything, he testified. What I'd seen, what I'd experienced, every message, every interaction. I handed over the flash drive. I gave them copies of my notes, every bit of documentation I had. He looked at the jury not as a movie star, but as a man. I'm not here to ask for sympathy, he said. I'm here to admit. My failure? I enabled this. By doing nothing, I allowed it to go on. Then his eyes locked on Diddy. And you counted on that, didn't you? He said quietly. You bet everything on fear being stronger than truth. There was a weight in the room, a silence that seemed to stretch for minutes. Will closed his eyes briefly, gathering himself. The prosecution asked me what changed, he continued. What finally pushed me over the edge? He paused, then said just one word, tapes. The courtroom stirred. Whispers darted between reporters and observers. But Will wasn't done. He explained that a former assistant, someone inside Diddy's inner circle, had approached him. Discreetly. They'd been carrying a terrible burden for years, guarding a digital vault filled with secrets. Videos, emails, logs, hundreds of files categorized by name, usefulness, and the level of damage they could cause. They showed me the archive, Will said. I didn't get to keep it. It had already been turned over to federal agents. But I saw enough. Enough to know it was real. He even saw his own name on that list. Time-stamped, indexed, flagged when the prosecutor asked him to confirm an email thread. Will nodded solemnly. It was a strategy, he explained. A calculated attack on a woman who had spoken out. They planned to discredit her, manipulate her finances, and if that didn't work, humiliate her. 3 weeks after those emails were exchanged, that actress vanished from the public eye. She announced she was struggling with her memory, claimed she needed to step away from the spotlight. She hasn't worked since. Will's voice dropped an octave. That's not coincidence. That's what this system does. Will didn't mince words when describing what he had uncovered. This wasn't just about some twisted parties or isolated scandals. It was an entire framework of control, calculated down to the finest detail. What I saw, he said, was a full-scale system built not on talent or merit, but on fear, coercion, and exploitation. The videos, the blackmail, the carefully timed leaks. All of it existed for one reason: to ensure power never left the hands of those orchestrating it in the courtroom. A large monitor displayed an internal document retrieved from the investigation. A spreadsheet, innocuous at first glance until you read the notes next to each name. Terms like useful, explicit, intoxicated, minor present, and financial vulnerability were scrawled in the remarks column beside Alistair's. Executives and even politicians. Will recognized many of the names. They weren't guests, he said. They were targets. Then came another bombshell. The prosecutor handed Will a copy of an email chain that linked Diddy directly to a plan to neutralize a specific actress who had been speaking privately about her experiences. In the messages, Diddy and several associates laid out a chilling blueprint: release unrelated stories that would damage her public image, pressure producers and financiers to stall her upcoming projects, prepare selectively edited clips from past events that would cast her in a questionable light. The strategy was clear: break her down from all sides until she either shut up or broke completely. And it worked, Will said grimly. Within 3 weeks, that actress, once rising, bold, an outspoken knee-shaky statement about her mental health, saying she could no longer remember details clearly and was stepping away from the spotlight. She hasn't returned since. Will shifted his gaze back to Diddy. You didn't just silence her, he said. You erased her. The air in the room grew tighter, as if everyone had stopped breathing at once. But Will wasn't finished. A new exhibit appeared on the courtroom screens, a screenshot of a text conversation between Diddy and Will from 2018. It showed Will declining yet another invitation. For the third time in a row, Diddy's response was short but loaded. You're making this harder than it has to be. Don't forget how we met. I'd hate for your kids to see you differently. Will's hands were steady, his voice calm. That was the first time he didn't just imply something, he made it plain. If I kept refusing, he'd use what he had. So Will did what he had to do. He shut down remote access to his home security systems, set up private communication lines, created physical backups of all his digital correspondence. He began preparing not for if the hammer dropped, but when. I knew something would be released eventually, he said. It was just a matter of time. But what changed his mind about testifying wasn't the fear. It was something else. Will described a conversation with another witness in the case. A conversation that would ultimately be the turning point. This person, like him, had seen the tapes. They had lived through the manipulation. But unlike Will, they had no protection, no global fame, no team of attorneys on retainer, and they were still willing to speak up. He said, emotion rising in his voice. That bravery was contagious. It forced Will to ask himself the question he'd been avoiding for years. If I'm not willing to tell the truth now, when? So he did. I didn't come forward because I'm brave, he told the jury. I came forward because someone else was. He gestured to the gallery behind him, because staying silent had become more dangerous than speaking out. Because if this could happen to me, with all my resources and reach, imagine what it's like for someone without any of that. The court went silent again. Then the judge offered Will something unexpected: permission to address Diddy directly. Will stood from the witness box, straightened his back, and looked Diddy in the eyes. This wasn't business, he began. This was manipulation dressed up as loyalty. You didn't build an empire, you built a trap. Diddy said nothing. His attorney leaned in, whispering rapidly, but Diddy stayed perfectly still. For the first time during the entire trial, he looked. Afraid I saw what you did, Will said. 2 people who disobeyed. 2 people who trusted you. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small. A flash drive. You sent this to me as a form of insurance. A reminder that I was now one of you. Well, here it is. Useless now. The truth's already out. He laid it gently on the evidence table, then he turned back to the jurors. If you think this is just about parties or bad behavior behind closed doors, you're missing the point. This was about control, about silencing people, compromising them, and shaping the entire industry based on fear. He paused. It didn't just affect individuals, it affected the content we consumed. Who got hired? Whose stories were told? Who disappeared and why? He looked back at Diddy one final time. You once said, bad boy for life. But that life, it's over. Will quietly returned to the witness box, gathered his notes, and stepped down as he walked out. The courtroom remained frozen in stunned silence. Not a sound from the judge, not a whisper from the press. Just the sight of Will Smith exiting, not as a movie star, but as a man who had finally unburdened himself. Diddy, meanwhile, sat slumped in his seat. Gone was the confident mogul who had once seemed untouchable. His hands shook as he scribbled something for his attorneys. He looked around the courtroom not with power, but with panic. For the first time in decades, he was no longer in control of the narrative. Outside the courthouse, chaos unfolded. Cameras clicked like machine guns. Journalists shoved microphones toward anyone with a badge, a suit, or even the faintest whiff of relevance. But Will didn't stop. He didn't answer a single question. No smiles, no waves. Just a straight, silent walk to the black SUV waiting at the curb. His security team formed a protective wall around him, shielding him from the crowd. But even without a statement, his face said everything. It wasn't victory, it was release. Later that evening, a reporter managed to shout out one final question as Will's door closed. Are you afraid of retaliation? He looked back for only a second. His response, according to witnesses, was quiet, but cutting. The truth doesn't fear the light, only lies do. What happened next wasn't just a ripple, it was an earthquake. Behind closed doors in Hollywood, boardroom meetings turned into emergency summits. Studio execs who had long stayed neutral were suddenly panicking. Legal teams combed through contracts, looking for escape clauses. Publicists worked overtime, drafting vague statements for clients who had once partied with Diddy. Now desperate to create distance, artists who had collaborated with him for decades began releasing neatly worded disclaimers. I was unaware of any misconduct. I only attended a handful of events. My association was strictly professional. And then came the internal reviews. Brand partnerships paused. Sponsorship deals frozen. Crisis teams called in to assess damage. But the most telling response, it came from the public social media lit up like wildfire. Hashtags trended. Clips of Will's testimony, or at least reenactments based on transcripts, circulated millions of times within hours. TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter filled with commentary, breakdowns, and theories. Even late-night comedians, once hesitant, began openly mocking Diddy's downfall. People started rewatching old interviews with Will, analyzing awkward moments when Diddy's name came up. Suddenly, those moments where Will looked tense changed the subject, or forced a smile didn't seem so innocent anymore. Photos from red carpets and industry events resurfaced, showing them in the same space but never interacting. Observers noted how they'd never once shared the stage or a photo op. Despite years in the same circles, media analysts began connecting dots that had long been brushed off. Why did certain stars suddenly disappear after cutting ties with Diddy? Why did smear campaigns pop up right after public fallouts? Why did some careers take off, while others, equally talented, just ... flatlined? The story that Will told wasn't just plausibly filled in blanks. People had been tiptoeing around for years, and the impact. Immediate. The prosecution, emboldened by Will's testimony, announced within 48 hours that 3 more high-profile witnesses had agreed to testify. These were names that had previously refused to speak, too afraid, too exposed, too threatened. But now the silence was cracking. The fear was breaking, and Diddy. His empire was crumbling. Stock values in his companies fluctuated wildly as investors grew cautious. Some of the most prominent brands that had licensed his name or image began pulling content. His curated playlists vanished from streaming services, not loudly, but quietly, without notice. A wave of reconsideration swept across the industry. This wasn't hearsay anymore, it was data, documentation, patterned behavior. Matched by multiple testimonies, as one legal analyst on a major news network put it. What makes Will's account so damning isn't just that he's famous, it's the detail, the receipts, the consistency with other witnesses. This is no longer just an accusation, it's a case. And perhaps, more importantly, it was inspiring others. Agents, assistants, and background players across the entertainment ecosystem started coming forward. Not all of them with tales about Diddy specifically, but about the culture he represented, one where silence was currency and simplicity was the price of admission. Therapists who specialized in trauma reported a surge in calls. One even told a journalist, "We're seeing something like a communal PTSD response. People are finally naming the thing they've lived under for so long. And it's not just fear, it's grief. Grief for the careers that ended before they began. Grief for the friendships sacrificed in the name of survival. Grief for the belief that this was just how things worked." Will, meanwhile, stepped away from the spotlight, according to sources. Close to him, he retreated into a quiet period, spending time with his family and seeking counseling. This wasn't about publicity, a longtime friend said. He didn't want attention. He wanted to purge what had been poisoning him for years. In legal circles, the implications of Will's appearance continued to stir debate. A former district attorney weighed in when someone like Will Smith, whose reputation, credibility, and image are incredibly valuable, goes on record like that. It carries weight. The defense can try to spin it as dramatized or self-serving, but they'll have a hard time dismissing someone that well-documented. Indeed, when court resumed the next day, the presiding judge addressed the matter directly. "This court recognizes the gravity of Mr. Smith's testimony," the judge said. "We do not operate based on spectacle. We deal in facts and evidence. And we honor the risk taken by every witness who steps forward." The prosecution wasted no time using Will's statement as a launchpad. More documents were introduced. More witnesses were prepped. And what had once seemed like scattered, isolated events, they began to form a clear picture of a structure, a system, a method of operation, One assistant put it plainly, "There's a reason all these stories match, because this wasn't random. It was organized." Diddy's legal team, visibly shaken, tried to regain ground. Their strategy thus far had been to paint the accusers as opportunists or disgruntled individuals with grudges. But Will, he didn't fit the mold. He had nothing to gain and everything to lose. And so their cross-examination, it fell flat. No matter how they pressed him, Will remained. Composed, they tried to catch him on inconsistencies, but his story held firm. He had receipts, had timelines. He had corroboration, and more than that, he had conviction. By the end of his testimony, the contrast between the two men couldn't have been more stark. WillSmith.com unburdened. Finally, free of the shadow he'd lived under. Diddy, rattled, silent. His carefully crafted image of control unraveling in real time. And though no verdict had been reached yet, one thing was already clear to everyone watching. Will hadn't just testified against a man, he had testified against a machine, a system that blurred the line between power and permission, silence and support, complicity and survival, and in doing so, he didn't just tell the truth, he changed it. In the days that followed Will Smith's testimony, the industry began to fracture, and not just in hushed conversations or cautious tweets, but in real, visible ways. Music executives were summoned into crisis meetings. Production deals once deemed untouchable were abruptly canceled or reevaluated. Major advertising agencies quietly pulled funding from projects tied to Diddy's enterprises. The ripple effects spread far beyond him because the story wasn't just about one man, it was about everything he touched. Even platforms started reacting. Without announcements or fanfare, his music began disappearing from curated playlists. Streaming services deprioritized his content in algorithms. One insider at a major tech company described it this way: "No one wants to be the last one left backing him when the dam breaks." And behind the scenes, legal departments worked. Around the clock, agreements were reviewed line by line. Collaborations were paused. Staffers were warned not to delete emails. This wasn't just cleanup, it was containment. Everyone who had ever done business with Diddy was scrambling to figure out just how deep this went and what might surface next. Meanwhile, in homes and dressing rooms across the country, entertainers and professionals began having long overdue conversations. A respected screenwriter tweeted, "I always wondered why my project with Will got shelved. Now I think I know." A talent manager admitted, "I warned my client not to say no to that invite. I'm ashamed I did that." One actress simply posted, "The house, I remember it." Each confession lit a fire under a conversation that had been waiting to happen for decades about the price of success, the cost of silence, and the unspoken threats that governed it all. Mental health professionals began sounding the alarm as well. Therapists saw a dramatic uptick in former clients returning. New patients began opening up about experiences they'd long buried. Some had convinced themselves those nights were just weird or foggy. Others had no name for what they'd gone through until now. "This isn't a scandal," one trauma specialist said. "It's a reckoning." And yet, through all the noise, Will remained quiet. He didn't tour the talk shows. He didn't drop a towel. He didn't sign a book deal. According to those closest to him, he was exhausted but relieved, not victorious, not vindicated, just lighter. He didn't want applause, one friend said. He wanted release. His team issued no statement. When reporters caught up with him days later outside a cafe, he offered only a simple reply. "I said, what I needed to say." The legal implications of his testimony, however, couldn't be ignored. Prosecutors quickly filed motions to admit new evidence supported by Will's account. Other witnesses, emboldened, were no longer backing out, even those who had once feared. Being discredited suddenly had a path forward. Because, if someone of Will's stature could speak, they no longer felt alone. And that was the turning point. For years, Diddy's legal strategy had revolved around discrediting his accusers, framing them as opportunists, as bitter has-beens, as unstable or confused. But with Will, that strategy failed before it even began. Here was a man with everything to lose: wealth, reputation, global fame, nothing obvious to gain. He wasn't suing. He wasn't promoting a new film. He wasn't trying to reposition himself. He just told the truth. And that truth couldn't be ignored. The final day of that week in court felt more like a cultural event than a legal proceeding. Reporters filled every available seat. Sketch artists captured every glance. The gallery was packed with industry observers, former colleagues, and even a few quiet celebrities, hats low, eyes alert. When the judge entered, the room fell into perfect stillness. This court does not traffic in spectacle, the judge reminded them, but it does listen, and it does seek truth. The prosecution moved quickly, using Will's testimony to draw a clear pattern. Multiple witnesses, same method of operation. Compromising footage, sudden career shifts. Coordinated reputational attacks. It was no longer anecdotal, it was systemic, and Diddy. He said nothing. For most of the proceedings, he scribbled on his legal pad, but his energy had changed. The bravado was gone. The posturing evaporated. He no longer looked like a mogul. He looked like a man watching the collapse of a kingdom he once thought invincible. During cross-examination, his lawyers avoided Will's story almost entirely. They tried to downplay inconsistencies in older witness accounts, raising technicalities and minor contradictions. But the damage was already done. And as the court recessed for the day, the image left in everyone's minds wasn't legal wrangling or procedural arguments. It was two faces. Will Smith, looking unburdened for the first time in years, and Diddy, pale and still, staring down the crater of a world he could no longer control. One cultural critic summed it up best in a post that quickly went viral. Will didn't just testify against a man, he testified against a system that taught power could be traded for silence, that compliance was the cost of success, and that fear was the currency of fame. By the time Will's SUV pulled away from the courthouse that final day, the fallout had already begun reshaping the industry. Calls poured into support lines. Crisis. Teams expanded overnight. Studios set up internal investigations and outside audits. And, most significantly, voices once silenced found strength in numbers. The reckoning had started with a whisper. Now, it was a roar.